what if Stannis Baratheon never died? What if Stannis won? How could he have done this, and what would it have looked like? Was it even possible? We know in the books, since they aren't finished, that Stannis is still currently alive in George R.R. Martin's timeline, and certain events like Stannis sacrificing his daughter at the wishes of the Red Woman and, of course, the Lord of Light never happened and might actually never happen in the book version of the character, and could in fact be a much different character altogether. Stannis, to me, is one of the more complex characters of the show, and certainly one of my favorites to watch. An honorable and noble Mad King of sorts. He believed it was his destiny and his duty to serve the Lord of Light, even though that was never his intent. He wasn't born thinking he was going to be king, or thinking he had this greater purpose of saving the living from the dead or serving the Lord of Light. But he knew, once his brother King Robert had been killed, that Robert's children were in fact the offspring of Jaime Lannister. Stannis, the Onion Knights, or Davos, hell, half of Westeros knew the truth. That Stannis Baratheon was the rightful heir, not Renly, nor Joffrey. In order for Stannis to truly be victorious in his conquest, he needed the one thing that he thought he had, but didn't. The one thing that Melisandre said not only was his birthright, but his destiny, was never actually his at all. And in fact, he was so convinced he thought he already had this unbeatable card up his sleeve that just a matter of weeks before his death, this unattainable element that Stannis and his mission had been missing for so long was literally staring him right in the face, and he let it slip through his fingers. When Stannis and his army attacked the wildlings north of the wall is when King Stannis first laid eyes on the prize he sought, the prize he thought he himself was. The one thing his Red Priestess and the visions in the flames had promised had already stared Stannis right in the eyes and spoke to him. And Stannis had no true understanding at the time what he was in the presence of in the woods, or when he saw it again at the wall. To be fair, he wasn't exactly looking for it, since the priestess had told him he had already attained it, that in fact he himself was it, that as long as he stayed loyal to the Lord of Light, this card would stay up his sleeve. Unfortunately, Melisandre was wrong. So what is this priceless possession? I, of course, am talking of the Lord of Light's champion, the prince who was promised. In this case, Jon Snow. As soon as Stannis saw Jon, he knew there was something different about him. Despite his false bastard rank, maybe he wasn't wielding a flaming sword, but he was wielding arguably the most dangerous yet important sword in Westeros, in the fact that it was the first sword to kill a White Walker in centuries, and sure, he wasn't the one to put the Night King down, but the prophecy never went into direct specifics, and it's without question that Arya, Jon, Stannis, and many others had their part to play in the Lord of Light's plan against the army of the dead, and even his plans in general. But if Stannis, the honorable king, was able to get past all the delusions and misreadings from Melisandre and get past his years of paranoia, then maybe he would have spotted Jon Snow in the visions, as opposed to himself. Or maybe he would have given Jon an offer he just absolutely couldn't refuse. But either way, Stannis was not leaving the wall without Jon Snow at his side after learning this revelation. As we saw in the Battle of Winterfell, Stannis and his men were decimated by Ramsay, and the Bolton army and eventually was cut down by Brienne of Tarth. His army was run down and exhausted from trucking through the snow, and half of his forces abandoned him after burning the princess. In this scenario, Stannis and all of his army would leave the wall, now united, being followed by the Lord Commander, who is also now the newly appointed Jon Stark, Lord of Winterfell, Warden of the North, as well as the Night's Watch, the Wildlings, Stannis' sellswords, as well as Stannis' faithful followers, as they all headed together towards Winterfell to take back not only the castle from the Boltons, but the North itself. a task that seemed impossible to the Starks up until this point. After Ned, Robb, and Catelyn's death, it seemed the era of the Starks and Baratheons were over for good. But now the new unification between houses Stark and Baratheon spread news like wildfire, rallying other small northern houses to the cause and rallying behind King Stannis, and even stirring up some division in the south between the Lannisters and the Dornish. But King Stannis had the thing that nobody else had. He had the one thing that multiple stab wounds, the Bolton army, wildlings, White Walkers, the Night King, or even an undead dragon could not kill. They couldn't kill Jon. They couldn't kill Aegon Targaryen, the prince who was promised. Of course, Stannis only knew the quote-unquote true heritage of Jon Snow, which was that his father was Ned Stark. If he knew the truth of Jon's Targaryen's heritage, he would surely have the same distaste most Baratheons had for their Targaryen rivals. But as long as this secret stayed buried, the bond and unification between these two houses would remain unified under Stannis' rule, and the Lord of Light's vision, with the wildlings, giants, Northmen, sellswords, and Baratheon Stark loyalists, with the prince who was promised right by his side. Stannis was untouchable. After taking Winterfell easily and executing the Boltons for their betrayal, they would move onward south to King's Landing to remove the lies and deceit that the Lannisters had plagued the capital with for years. They had their red and gold cloaks surrounding the capital in its defense, as well as having the Greyjoy Armada in the seas as the Stark Baratheon army marched towards the Red Keep. Unfortunately, there was a third party that coveted the throne. A third party that has remained elsewhere in the east, and shortly after Stannis and his men had left Dragonstone, this third party had just touched down. The Mother of Dragons, with her army and 3 children headed straight for the Red Keep, the Unsullied and the Dothraki in tow. The Lannister army had been fighting the Dothraki in a few different battles and skirmishes, but nothing like the swarming they were leading on now, cutting through the Lannister men as well as the citizens alike. The Lannisters were well-trained and some of the most brutal, cutthroat, savagely trained soldiers in Westeros, and they stood no chance against the savage, wild nature of the Dothraki or the organized, torturous methods of the Unsullied. As Lannisters were getting killed by Unsullied, the Wildlings and Northmen would get the jump on the Lannisters. The Dothraki would tear through, then the Giants, the Greyjoys, everyone everywhere in the capital all at once, triple threat warfare. But no matter what, the Baratheon and Stark alliance had the most important weapon of all, the Lord of Light's champion, Jon Snow, who was named Hand of the King, who was protected from most harm by the Lord's light, and as long as Stannis had Jon by his side and was in the dark about his own true Targaryen heritage, then Stannis' reign would meet no rival. Well, that is until something happened. Everyone asleep at the wall was awoken by the normal-sounding horn of returning brothers and could rest easy. However, after the second horn, all brothers were suddenly on high alert. But after the third horn, everything would change. The biggest battle to Stannis' reign and the newly reformed Seven Kingdoms would face the army of the dead. Make sure to come back to find out what happens next, and feel free to tell your own stories and theories down in the comments below. Thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you next time.